Hello, let's do radioactivity number 13, nuclear accidents. And there have been a few nuclear accidents, and we're following this on from when we were learning about nuclear reactors, because they all have to deal with nuclear reactors. The major accidents that have occurred are three. One's called 3 Mile Island, 1979. One is Chernobyl, which was in 1986, way before you guys, and the most recent was in Fukushima, only a couple of years ago. So we'll just quickly look at those and just put them into context. 3 Mile Island, there it is, looking much like any other nuclear reactors. These are the cooling towers. This and this are the actual reactors. And usually you will find the nuclear reactors next to a body of water because they need it for the cooling process. Now what happened? It's the worst accident in US history, but there were no injuries from it. What happened was the reactor core melted because there was a loss of coolant, and a small amount of radiation vented. People were evacuated, and there was a fear that what happens is you can get what's called the China syndrome, and that's where the core of the nuclear reactor becomes unstable, gets super hot, and starts melting its way through the containment vessel. And if that happens, if it gets out of the containment vessel, what the fear is, it then hits a body of water like groundwater or just water somewhere, and it blows up, and you get a highly radioactive steam cloud that then dissipates through the atmosphere and causes a huge area. So although the core in this case melted, it remained within the containment vessel, and therefore the effects were small. The potential was quite huge, but the effects in this case was small. Now it was caused by a combination of personal error, design deficiencies, and component failure. And although they put in multiple fail-safes into nuclear reactors, sometimes unforeseen things can happen, and they try and model every scenario, and they try and learn from every mistake. But again, they're such complicated pieces of machinery, and humans are not always the best operators. Now Chernobyl was a reactor in April 26. They were doing a test on one of the reactors, and they wanted to make sure that the coolant pumps were working. So they isolated the reactor, and they only had it running on a certain cooling pump. And during the test there was a power surge that cut out the power to that pump, which then caused overheating in the coolant system, which then caused an explosion, which then caused the fuel rods to melt, which then ignited the graphite, which was inside the reactor, which was a neutron absorber. And so once that graphite fire started, it released a massive cloud of radioactivity into the atmosphere, and the core started melting its way through the floor of the buildings. And this is what it looked like after the event. So quite a massive explosion, and the core was actually, or the reactor was actually exposed. The containment vessel was ruptured completely, and this is after the event. So there's a crane, so it's quite a while after it, and the core is again in there as well. And so when this first exploded and this was on fire, there was no way of putting out the fire. If you go onto YouTube or something, you'll see some videos of helicopters trying to drop sand down there, and they also got human volunteers. They had to scale up the outside of one of these buildings and then run across the roof with a shovel of sand and then throw it into the reactor. And they used about 20,000 of these people, because you could really only do it once before you got a massive dose, and therefore they had thousands of guys, and they had very little protective equipment. They were just given these sort of leady type vests and breathing apparatus, and basically they were all pretty much military conscripts, so they didn't have much choice in it, and they had to run along there, throw a bit of sand, and then run away. And no one really knows what medical effects they had, because this occurred behind what was called the Iron Curtain, and in those days there wasn't much media, or the media was very much controlled in the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union related countries, and therefore not everyone is actually certain what happened to those people and those volunteers, in inverted commas. But there's a video on YouTube. I'll probably tell you to skip the first 22 seconds because I think it's a news broadcast that looks at one of the anniversaries of Chernobyl, so there's some footage of the actual event. Now, once they put out the fire, they then had to contain everything, and this is actually an ongoing problem many years after the actual event. And at one stage they were in a panic because they couldn't locate the core. Like they knew where the core was, but of course the explosion and collapsed floors and buildings completely array, and the radiation was so high they couldn't actually find the core. And so some of the technicians went in with Geiger counters and were scurrying around the building and in the basements and various conduits and things, and eventually they came across this, and this was the actual radioactive core from the reactor sitting in a basement. It had melted its way through, and it had just stopped progressing any further. But that was one of the major concerns, was that it would keep going, work its way down into the groundwater, and then cause a massive, even more massive explosion. This is an interesting photo because this is all the equipment they used, because they had to evacuate a town with a minute's notice. After the event they evacuated the town, so a whole town significantly bigger than Launceston had to be evacuated, and they still can't go back. They just had to leave everything, and the military came in and closed things off and were ferrying things around, and all this equipment was used now has to just be stockpiled because it's too radioactive to be used. These were some of the helicopters used, and there's whole fields of these. This is just one picture, because things became too radioactive to ever be used again. This is a picture that shows you the radioactive fallout. There's Chernobyl. This is Europe. Hopefully you know Europe. There's the UK, if you want to get a bearing, and Italy. And so the red and the dark red are where the highest counts went, and so the plume that rose up, the smoke, was then distributed in the higher levels of the atmosphere, and one big plume went over the Scandinavian states and then made it down to England, and another went over Europe, and some went into this area here. And there are still areas in these countries with the red where you can't actually use the milk from cows that graze on the pastures, because the cows are eating the grass is picking up the isotopes that fell on the soil, and so the milk is actually radioactive, and that's going to be for another few years yet still in certain areas. This is another one that shows that the whole radiation then went around the whole upper or the northern hemisphere, even reached across to America and Canada and bits of the Pacific and Japan. So the fallout pattern was quite extensive from that one explosion. Now, Fukushima is the most recent one, and it happened after a tsunami. The power plant was actually next to the ocean, and a tsunami swept through, went over the rock wall that was supposed to protect the reactor, and what the water did is it knocked out all the emergency power supplies, and so all the diesel generators and all the substations that distributed all that power were knocked out, and basically the reactor was supposed to go into shutdown mode, but it didn't, because the reactors itself have been damaged by the earthquake. So there's a combination of earthquake and tsunami that caused it. On your OneNote there'll be 2 PDF files that give you a lot more details about what actually happens. And this is the picture, one of the pictures of it exploding. What was happening was the reactors were basically they were making excessive amounts of hydrogen because they were putting water on them to try and cool them down because the coolant systems had failed. And by spraying water onto the radioactive cores, they were generating hydrogen, and hydrogen is very explosive, so the hydrogen would build up, some spark would occur, or the heat would ignite it, and the whole building would blow up. And this went through a series of these that just made the problem worse and worse. So this is just showing you where Fukushima was. 2 reactors were concerned. There were 4 reactors at Fukushima, and 2 of them failed. And this is the epicenter for, or that was the epicenter for the earthquake and then the tsunami. And this just shows all the other reactors in Japan. Japan had a fairly extensive nuclear power system, and after this they shut down all the reactors, and 3 years on they're only just restarting some of them. And the Japanese population has basically, or the politicians have also decided that perhaps nuclear reactors are not necessarily the way to go. They need a combination of systems, but that's politics. Anything can change. And this is what it actually looked like. So these 4 square buildings, 1, 2, 3, 4, were the reactors, and you can see 2 of the reactors blew up. And this is the ocean, and this is the wall, and there's another wall. And so all this infrastructure around here got swept away and destroyed by the tsunami, and therefore it went out of control. And this basically describes what happens, which is what I've already said. And there's a video which is a click view video, so there'll be a link to that on your OneNote. And in the next video, which will be our last one, we'll look at fusion and what we do with nuclear waste. See ya!